In the shimmering world of Tudor England, Queen Elizabeth I reigned not just with scepter and sword, but with spectacle. She was the Virgin Queen, the Gloriana of myth, wrapped in silks, pearls, and symbolism. Her presence was curated to the point of near divinity, untouched, unblemished, untouchable. But beneath the powder, under the perfumed gloves and the meticulously arranged wigs, lay a woman ruled not only by power, but by fear. Fear of weakness, fear of exposure, fear of the flesh. What did the Queen actually smell like? How often did she bathe? What lurked beneath the layers of lead paint and rosewater? These are the questions history whispers but rarely answers. Because to ask about hygiene in Elizabeth's time is to ask about more than soap and water. It's to ask how a queen constructs a legend while her body betrays her. It's to unravel the truth buried under the performance. And it's to recognize that for Elizabeth, cleanliness wasn't healthy, was illusion. She lived in a world where science and superstition blurred, where myrrh masked the stench of human waste, and where sugar was both delicacy and death. In this world, cleanliness was a matter of appearances. Her body was political real estate, and every pore, every breath, every smell had meaning. This is not a story of medieval ignorance. It is a story of strategy. Elizabeth wasn't dirty because she didn't know better. She was dirty because cleanliness, in the modern sense, threatened her image. A bath could dissolve the illusion. A blemish could crumble the crown. And so, she curated not only what people saw, but what they didn't. She did not bathe in water. She bathed in myth. She did not cleanse her body, she disguised it. And behind the elaborate gowns and icy stares, behind the portraits scrubbed of wrinkles and the court protocols designed to maintain distance, Elizabeth hid a reality few dared to confront. Over the next 45 minutes, we'll uncover the top 13 most disgusting hygiene habits of Queen Elizabeth I. But more than that, we'll peel back the layers of a monarch whose filth was as deliberate as her dignity. Each habit is a glimpse into her rule, not as a sanitized page in history, but as a performance of power written in perfume, powdered lead, and unbearable stench. From blackened teeth turned fashion statement, to wigs stiffened with sugar water, to toilet rituals involving noblemen with unmatched intimacy, what you're about to hear will transform how you understand Elizabeth I, not just as a queen, but as a master of controlled decay. So brace yourself, because this isn't the Elizabeth you were taught to admire. This is the Elizabeth who hid rot beneath roses, and once you see her this way, you'll never forget the smell of royalty again. Among the many contradictions of Elizabeth I, none are more jarring than the dazzling opulence of her court contrasted with the silent rot in her mouth. In an age where refined sugar was a luxury rarer than rubies, Elizabeth consumed it with unmatched indulgence. But behind the shimmering feasts and candied violets lay a secret she couldn't sweeten away. Her teeth were decaying, blackening, and falling out. Elizabeth adored sugar. It was a symbol of wealth, empire, and dominance. Preserved fruits, sugar-drenched marzipan, crystallized roses weren't just desserts. They were displays of imperial power. Sugar was imported in locked chests, counted like gold. To indulge was to rule, and Elizabeth ruled in spoonfuls. But the sweet irony was bitter. Dental hygiene, as we understand it, did not exist. The Queen purportedly cleaned her teeth with a paste of honey, sugar, and ground herbs, a method that today sounds like a dentist's nightmare. The sugary concoction, combined with abrasive powders like crushed eggshells or pumice, did more harm than help. Instead of preserving her teeth, It scoured the enamel and fed the bacteria. Her mouth became a battlefield. By the 1590s, reports began to circulate. Foreign ambassadors whispered of her blackened teeth, noting that several had fallen out. Her breath was so fetid it disturbed those near her. John Gerard, a respected herbalist of the era, described her breath as a thing most foul. Some courtiers reportedly struggled to understand her speech, not from her royal accent, but because gaps had formed where teeth once stood. And yet, she refused dental intervention. The pain of tooth extraction in the 16th century was excruciating and done without anesthesia. Her physicians urged her to remove the rotten teeth. She declined. In one particularly theatrical moment, a courtier volunteered to have a tooth pulled in front of her just to prove it was survivable. Still, the Queen resisted. What followed was perhaps the strangest turn: courtly imitation. In a society obsessed with flattery and proximity to the crown, nobility began to mimic her dental decay. Elite women used soot or charcoal to blacken their teeth, a mark not of horror but high status. In a strange twist of courtly logic, to have black teeth was to be rich enough to afford sugar, and thus royal by proxy. To the outsider, this might seem grotesque, but within the Elizabethan bubble, the Queen's appearance defined beauty. Even her flaws became fashionable. In this context, rot became refinement, pain became power. Elizabeth's teeth, or what was left of them, were no longer just a personal affliction, they were a trend. And yet, we must ask, what was it like to be her? To smile through pain, to speak while aware of the odor escaping with every word. She, who ruled through image, had a face that betrayed her. Her courtiers dared not mention it. Portraits of her showed flawless rows of teeth, if any at all. And, in private, she doubled down on perfumed gloves and fragrant handkerchiefs, as if scent could erase decay. This was not vanity, it was survival. Her mouth was a battlefield, not just of bacteria, but of perception. A single visible flaw risked collapsing the entire edifice she'd spent decades building. She could not afford to appear weak, and so, like everything else in her court, her teeth became part of the myth. Carefully hidden, painfully ignored. One must remember Elizabeth was born into trauma. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed by her father. She knew that perception could mean life or death, so she learned to command it, even as her body crumbled. If her teeth fell out, she didn't replace them. She rewrote what beauty meant. If her breath turned foul, she enveloped herself in rosewater. She didn't change her hygiene, she changed the culture around it. In modern terms, this would be like a pop icon with a skin disease, turning it into a global fashion trend. Except this wasn't Instagram. This was a world of real rot, no antibiotics and zero anesthesia. Elizabeth did not hide from her decay. She transcended it. That's what made her terrifying and unforgettable. This was no mere dental issue. It was the perfect metaphor for her reign, glorious on the surface, festering underneath, and everyone pretended not to smell it. Few myths cling to Queen Elizabeth I as stubbornly as the one claiming she bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not. Though this quote is often repeated with a snicker, its deeper truth lies not in comedy, but in fear. In Elizabeth's world, water wasn't cleansing, it was dangerous. To bathe meant to risk everything. The medical understanding of the 16th century was steeped in humoral theory and ancient belief that the human body was governed by 4 fluids, and their balance determined health. Bathing was thought to disrupt that balance. Worse, water was believed to open the pores, inviting in miasmas, bad air, the invisible carriers of disease. Clean water was scarce, and still water often carried sickness. Immersing oneself in it wasn't just inconvenient, it was a gamble with death. For a monarch like Elizabeth, the stakes were even higher. Her body was the state. To appear weak was to invite revolt. So she avoided full bathing, not out of laziness or ignorance, but as a calculated decision. She wasn't alone. Most of her contemporaries did the same. But Elizabeth turned abstention into art. Instead of bathing, she embraced a ritual of linen. Her undergarments, called shifts, were made of fine linen and worn close to the skin. She changed these frequently, several times a day. It was believed that the linen would absorb sweat, oils, and impurities, thus keeping the body clean without water. To the Elizabethan mind, purity could be achieved through fabric, not fluid. Her attendants played a key role in this ritual. With each change of shift came an opportunity for gentle cleansing. They applied rosewater, vinegar rinses, and herbal infusions to her skin with cloths, delicately dabbing rather than scrubbing. These mixtures were carefully curated by palace apothecaries and served a dual purpose: to cleanse and to perfume. Scents like lavender, sage, and rosemary were common, both for their pleasant aroma and their supposed protective properties. And yet, when Elizabeth did bathe, it was a production bordering on coronation. Her palaces had no plumbing. Heated water had to be carried in buckets, one by one, and poured into a wooden tub lined with linen. It took multiple servants, hours of preparation, and a setting cleared of drafts to prevent illness. The Queen would sit in this tub like a relic on display, every movement monitored, every drop of water a risk. Such events were rare, reserved for specific occasions, and approached with reverence and caution. It's important to note Elizabeth was not considered unclean by the standards of her day. Quite the opposite. She was admired for her fragrance, her immaculate presentation, her attention to bodily rituals. But her cleanliness was not the modern kind. It was performative, symbolic. Her body didn't need to be washed. It needed to be seen as untouchable. Cleanliness in the Tudor court was not about sanitation. It was about optics. A monarch's body had to appear perfect, not be perfect. Elizabeth understood this better than anyone. She curated not only what people saw, but what they imagined. The scent of rosewater, the layers of powdered garments, the unblemished skin beneath toxic lead makeup, were illusions carefully layered to maintain her myth. Even within her private quarters, the avoidance of water had meaning. Mirrors were scarce. Candles were dim. Her face, when not painted, was hidden. She refused to be seen raw, because rawness implied reality. Elizabeth's power depended on transcendence. The less human she appeared, the more divine she became. In this context, the myth of the monthly bath makes perfect sense. Whether the quote is apocryphal or accurate, it captures the essence of Elizabethan hygiene: ritual over reality, perception over practice. Her court followed suit. Scented gloves, perfumed handkerchiefs, and herbal sachets tucked into bodices were standard. Washing with water was optional. Smelling like one had was essential. It was a world of substitutions. Water was replaced by vinegar. Soap was replaced by roses. Scrubbing was replaced by linen shifts, rubbed gently by loyal hands. A queen could go weeks without touching water and still be considered pristine. But what was truly being cleaned? Not the body, but the myth. Each ritual, each scented cloth, each carefully arranged shift was another stroke on the canvas of Gloriana. And beneath it all, the flesh waited, unseen, unwashed, unwelcome. Elizabeth's hygiene wasn't a failure. It was a fortress, built not of soap and baths, but of symbolism and scent. And to her subjects, that fortress worked. She wasn't just clean, she was sacred. Her face is one of the most iconic in history, milky white, eerily smooth, and utterly expressionless. But the beauty of Queen Elizabeth I wasn't natural, nor was it simply cosmetic. It was political. Her face was a weapon, a mask, and ultimately, a poison. In the court of Elizabeth, pale skin was more than fashionable, it was a declaration. To be fair-skinned was to signal nobility, chastity, and divine favor. Tanned or blemished skin was the mark of peasants, of laborers, of mortality. Elizabeth knew this, and she exploited it with ruthless precision. Her makeup of choice, Venetian cerisa, compound made of white lead and vinegar. It promised a flawless porcelain sheen. In truth, it was a slow, elegant death sentence. Every morning, Elizabeth's attendants layered her face with this deadly paste. Over time, it began to eat away at her skin, causing lesions, sores, and permanent scarring. And so, she applied more. The thicker the paint, the more invisible the rot beneath. She became, quite literally, a queen, erasing herself to survive. This wasn't vanity. It was armor. Elizabeth had inherited a nation torn apart by religious war, political betrayal, and the violent memory of her mother's execution. She had no husband, no heir, and no room for weakness. So she created a face that couldn't be read, couldn't be aged, and couldn't be questioned. A mask of eternal rule. Her cosmetics extended beyond seriousness. To achieve her infamous crimson lips, she used a mixture containing cinnabar mercury-based pigment. Like the lead on her cheeks, the mercury seeped into her bloodstream. The effects were devastating. Neurological symptoms, mood swings, and gradual physical deterioration. Her body was at war with the very tools she used to project power. But still, she persisted. No amount of illness could convince her to abandon the mask. As her skin worsened, she ordered that she be painted only under specific conditions, never in natural light, never without artistic guidance. Portrait artists were given stylized templates, reusing youthful features from earlier paintings. The real Elizabeth was concealed not just by powder, but by policy. By her later years, her makeup had become a cage. It cracked easily. It had to be reapplied constantly. Her face was so fragile that rumors spread it could not be touched without crumbling. She banned mirrors from her quarters. She could not risk glimpsing the truth behind the legend she had built. There are accounts of her growing increasingly paranoid, insisting on absolute control over how she was seen. She forbade unapproved portraits. She dismissed courtiers who commented on her appearance. She isolated herself, even from those closest to her, clinging to the mask as her real face deteriorated beneath it. And yet, her court followed her lead. Noblewomen, desperate to emulate their monarch, applied the same poisonous pastes. The paleness of death became the standard of beauty. Skin cracked, sores bled, but the performance continued. It was not about attraction, it was about aspiration. If Elizabeth wore it, it was divine, even if it killed you. This form of royal performance wasn't unique to Elizabeth, but she elevated it to obsession. She didn't just use cosmetics, she weaponized them. Her appearance was a message. I am not like you. I do not age. I do not falter. I do not decay. But, of course, she did. In private, her skin festered beneath the paint. Her lips trembled with mercury. Her health declined. but the myth remained pristine. She gave the world a version of herself that existed only in oils and echoes. One of the most haunting truths of Elizabeth's reign is how deeply she understood the value of illusion. Her face was not hers, was England's. Her body was not her on it, was the embodiment of a nation's pride, power, and perfection. If that meant wearing death on her skin, so be it. And so, the Queen lived behind a wall of powder and pigment, behind the scent of rose and the sting of lead. She never bathed her face regularly. To do so would be to wash away her rule, to rinse off her identity, to reveal the woman hiding beneath the goddess. In the end, her beauty was a lie told so convincingly that it outlived her. Even centuries later, her portraits gleam with a perfection she never knew. And perhaps that was the point. She didn't want to be remembered as human. She wanted to be remembered as eternal. In the splendor of Tudor palaces under ceilings painted in gold leaf, beside tapestries embroidered with myths, within chambers echoing with poetry and plots, there existed a stench. It was a quiet companion to the glory, unspoken but ever present. Because while Queen Elizabeth I ruled a kingdom, her body, like all others, had needs, and those needs left behind waste. There was no plumbing in Hampton Court or Richmond Palace, no pipes, no flushing, no porcelain. For all her majesty, Elizabeth lived in a world more medieval than modern. Human waste was managed by ritual, labor, and layers of scented denial. At the heart of this delicate affair was the Queen's close stool, an ornate cushioned chair with a hole carved in the seat, beneath which sat a ceramic or pewter chamber pot. This was not merely a toilet. It was a throne within a throne, often covered in velvet and embroidered to match the rest of her furnishings. The stool was not hidden in shame. It was part of her daily ritual, attended to with ceremony. And who managed this royal duty? Not a lowly servant, but one of the most prestigious figures in court, the groom of the stool. Despite its crude-sounding title, the position was one of immense power. The groom was a nobleman of unimpeachable trust, responsible not only for handling and cleaning the Queen's waste, but also for managing her schedule, private conversations, and sometimes even state secrets. Because no one spent more unguarded time with Elizabeth than the man who literally wiped her clean. The groom was expected to be discreet, intelligent, and politically savvy. This role offered unparalleled access. It was not uncommon for the groom to be consulted on sensitive matters, privy to conversations that would have never been shared in the official council. He helped dress her, assisted during travel, and managed her personal hygiene, not just out of necessity, but as part of the pageantry of control. But beyond the Queen's chamber, the picture grew much bleaker. For the rest of the palace, sanitation was a logistical nightmare. Most courtiers and staff used chamber pots which were emptied into large cesspits or trenches. These were often located just outside palace walls or, horrifyingly, beneath certain buildings. These pits were foul, disease-ridden, and frequently overflowed. And when they did, the solution was simple: move the court. Elizabeth's frequent relocations between royal residences weren't merely for politics or pleasure, they were a necessity. The longer the court remained in one place, the more unbearable the smell became. No perfumes or rose petals could mask the scent of human waste fermenting in the walls and floors of the palace. The task of emptying these pits fell to gong farmers or night soil men. These laborers worked under cover of darkness, carrying heavy, sloshing pails through narrow corridors and up steep stone staircases. The job was among the most reviled in the kingdom, yet essential. Without them, the royal court would have drowned in its own waste. Inside the palaces, herbs and aromatic rushes were scattered on the floors to absorb smells. Sweet-smelling plants like lavender, marjoram, and rosemary were crushed underfoot as people walked, a primitive form of air freshening. But these rushes were rarely changed. Over time, they accumulated layers of filth, spilled food, hair, vermin, and excrement. Insects and rodents thrived beneath them. It wasn't just dirty, it was alive. Elizabeth herself was acutely aware of the olfactory hazards of her court. She carried scented pomanders, small, orb-shaped containers filled with herbs and spices, either on her belt or held to her nose in public. Her handkerchiefs were soaked in rose oil or clove water. Every detail of her scent was choreographed. If she passed a particularly offensive noble, she would raise her perfumed glove in a subtle, cutting gesture. But even these strategies had limits. The smell of the Tudor court was often overwhelming. Visitors, particularly from countries with slightly more advanced sanitation, like Italy, recorded their astonishment at the filth of English palaces. Beneath the grandeur, they found rot, and yet it was all carefully hidden from the public eye. No one depicted the queen beside her close stool. No artist painted a set. Official records describe cleanliness in vague, ritualistic terms. The queen did refresh herself, without acknowledging the reality behind it. The fiction of royal purity was preserved at all costs. To understand the queen's hygiene is to understand her battle with reality. She could control her image, but not her waste. She could perfume her body, but not eliminate its needs. So instead, she created a system where even defecation became symbolic. She surrounded it with hierarchy, with loyalty, with luxury, and most importantly, with silence. Her groom of the stool didn't just empty her pot. He absorbed the truth. She refused to let show that beneath the white lead and velvet, beneath the jewels and the incense, she was flesh. She sweated, she bled, she smelled, but no one spoke of it, because Elizabeth had made the rules. And in her court, even her most human act was performed like a sacrament. In a world where water was feared and rot was masked rather than removed, fragrance became Queen Elizabeth I's greatest weapon. While her enemies wielded swords and foreign princes courted with politics, Elizabeth defended herself with scent. She didn't merely wear perfume, she wore a strategy. Fragrance was not just cosmetic. In the 16th century, it was considered medicinal. Bad smells were believed to carry disease, and pleasant ones were thought to repel it. To smell sweet was to signal health, holiness, and control. Elizabeth, who avoided bathing and covered her decaying skin with lead paint, turned to perfume to maintain her illusion. She wasn't just hiding odor, she was constructing an aura. Each morning, her attendants would prepare herbal infusions: lavender steeped in vinegar, rosemary blended with cloves, rosewater infused with marjoram. These potions were dabbed on her wrists, behind her ears, and around her collar. They were stored in crystal vials and silver flasks, applied with the same delicacy as her cosmetics. She didn't simply wear a scent, she became it. The Queen's personal still rooms, where herbs were processed and perfumes prepared, were as important as her council chambers. Apothecaries and perfumers worked alongside her servants, producing concoctions that were equal parts aromatherapy and armor. These weren't fleeting fragrances. They lingered in rooms after she left, announcing her presence, reinforcing her divinity. Pomanders were another key tool in her olfactory arsenal. These ornate, often gold or silver, spherical containers were filled with resins, herbs, or scented waxes. Elizabeth wore them on chains or tucked them into her bodice, occasionally raising them to her nose when court life banned its stench became unbearable. These were more than accessories. They were portable fortresses against the human condition. Her clothing, too, was scented. Gloves soaked in ambergris, gowns brushed with floral oils, embroidered handkerchiefs doused in myrrh and cinnamon. Her wardrobe was not only luxurious, it was aromatic. Guests reported that being near her was an experience of scent as much as sight. She didn't smell like a woman. She smelled like an idea. This perfumed presence extended beyond hygiene. It became a political gesture. When she gifted gloves, they were infused with her chosen, aroma-small, potent messages of favor. The court learned to associate certain smells with the Queen's moods, her power, her attention. To inhale Elizabeth's scent was to be drawn into her myth. It's tempting to see this as simple vanity, but that underestimates the genius behind it. Elizabeth's fragrance was not for pleasure, was for power. Every detail of her olfactory performance was calculated to maintain the illusion that she was more than mortal. If she could not cleanse herself with water, she would cleanse perception with perfume. Yet the irony is pungent. Beneath the lavender and cloves, her body decayed. Her skin blistered from toxic cosmetics. Her breath, made foul by rotting teeth, lingered despite the rosewater. Her wigs, powdered with starch and stiffened with sugar water, likely trapped sweat and oil. She could not escape her own biology, but she could drown it in scent. She doubled down on this ritual in her final years. As her health declined, her use of fragrance intensified. Her perfumes grew heavier, darker amber, musk, sandalwood. She carried multiple pomanders. Her bedchambers were said to smell like a garden under siege. She refused to be seen without her oils. Even when bedridden, she ordered rose-infused cloths to be laid over her pillows. Her very breath became ceremonial, and yet the people believed. To them, Elizabeth was ageless, clean, divine. Her scent, exotic, unearthly, was part of that illusion. She wasn't just hiding from decay. She was enchanting her kingdom into forgetting it existed. When Elizabeth died in 1603, it was said her chamber still smelled of rose and spice. Her body had begun to decay, but her myth held firm. The perfumes lingered longer than the truth. In the end, fragrance was not her mask. It was her spell. She perfumed not to deceive, but to dominate. To turn sweat into scripture, odor into omen, rot into reverence. In her world, where soap was rare and water was feared, she bathed not in liquid, but in legend. Queen Elizabeth I is often remembered for her elaborate hairstyles, towering red wigs, coiled curls, jeweled hairpieces that shimmered like the crown itself. But beneath the splendor of those carefully styled tresses lay a reality most would never suspect. Her natural hair was rarely seen, rarely washed, and eventually barely there at all. In Elizabeth's world, hair was not an expression of personality. It was a tool of image control. It was staged, scented, and above all hidden. From an early age, her natural hair, once auburn and striking, became a battleground of politics and preservation. Washing it was rare, brushing it was ritual, and eventually replacing it was essential. Hygiene practices of the Tudor court didn't include shampoo or regular washing. Soap for hair was harsh and stripping, and warm water baths were reserved for rare occasions. Instead, Elizabeth's hair was maintained using powders, pomades, and oils. Her attendants dusted it with scented starches to absorb oil and sweat. The powders were often made of flower, orris root, and even crushed roses. When mixed with sugar water or egg whites, they helped stiffen and hold elaborate styles in place, while simultaneously creating a paste that trapped dirt and promoted itching, lice, and scalp irritation. As Elizabeth aged, her hair began to thin, likely due to the lead in her face paint and the mercury in her lip color. These toxic elements didn't stay confined to her cheeks and lips. They seeped into her bloodstream, affected her hormones, and weakened her hair follicles. But boldness, like blemishes, was unacceptable for a queen who had built her image on divine permanence. So she did what she had always done. She transformed a flaw into theatre. Wigs became her new crown. Not simple coverings, but elaborate constructions of curled hair, often dyed red to mimic her youthful locks. These wigs were perfumed, powdered, and arranged to perfection. Each one was a statement of power, artifice, and control. They concealed not just her scalp, but the truth. Wearing wigs was no easy feat. They were heavy, stiff, and required constant maintenance. Beneath them, her real scalp was rarely aired, and when the wigs came off, if they ever did it, was only in complete privacy. Some records suggest that no one but her most trusted attendants ever saw her bald head. She would sleep in linen, caps infused with rose oil, further controlling the scent that might escape from her hidden skin. What's striking is how wigs transitioned from necessity to fashion. As with her blackened teeth and leaden skin, what began as concealment became aspiration. Noble women began to copy the queen's wigs, wearing similarly styled pieces, scented with herbs, even when they didn't need them. In the court of Elizabeth, imitation was the ultimate form of loyalty. To look like the queen, no matter how artificial, was to belong. Her wigs were more than fashion, they were symbolic armor. They covered not just aging, but vulnerability. Her real hair may have thinned, may have grayed, may have disappeared, but no one saw it. Instead, they saw fire-red curls and gold-threaded designs, a queen untouched by time. There are stories, some likely exaggerated, that by her final years, Elizabeth's hairline had receded so dramatically that her wigs had to be glued in place with gum arabic or animal glue. She allegedly refused to allow her physicians to examine her scalp, not from pain, but from pride. She had ruled England for decades as an icon. She would not end her reign as a mortal woman. Even in portraits, her wigs played a starring role. Painters were instructed to replicate earlier styles, borrowing details from past artworks. This created a frozen image, an eternal queen whose hair never thinned, whose style never faltered. Her image, once again, was more enduring than her reality. And yet, the genius of Elizabeth was her ability to turn these necessities into narratives. Her wigs weren't lies, they were extensions of her legend. She wore them like armor, like scepters of silence, reminding all who saw her, this was no ordinary woman. This was a monarch who refused to let nature write her story. Today, wigs are worn openly, fashionably, sometimes playfully. But in Elizabeth's time, to wear a wig was a secret shouted through silence. It was a defiance of decay. A whisper that said, "I may age, but you will not see it." Her untouched tresses were not signs of laziness or indulgence. They were calculated omissions. She did not wash her hair, because to do so would be to reveal its fragility. She did not show her scalp, because it was no longer hers, belonged to England. In the court of Queen Elizabeth I, diplomacy wasn't conducted solely through treaties or battle formations. It was often waged in gestures, glances and gloves. Yes, gloves. Few items were more emblematic of Elizabeth's power than the scented gloves she wore, gifted and wielded like tools of calculated charm and controlled favor. To the modern mind, a glove is a simple accessory. To Elizabeth, it was a message. Her gloves were made of the finest leather-skid dough or lambskins, fawned and embroidered with gold thread and pearls. But they weren't simply beautiful. They were perfumed, soaked in exotic oils and bergris, musk, jasmine, often lined with herbs like cloves or cinnamon. Her gloves became walking clouds of fragrance. They didn't just mask the smells of court life, they carried her signature. To catch the scent of her gloves was to know the Queen had passed. It was branding by aroma. She touched no one without scent, and her touch was rarely forgotten. Elizabeth used gloves as instruments of diplomacy. When she wanted to reward a noble, she might hand him one of her gloves. This was no trifle. To receive a glove from the Queen was a profound honor, intimate, symbolic, and deeply political. It meant favor. It meant proximity. It meant you had touched, if not her skin, then something blessed by her hand. There are records of foreign dignitaries being gifted gloves after an audience, their soft linings imbued with her perfume, tucked away in chests like relics. English lords, desperate for royal approval, would frame the gloves she gave them, display them publicly, boast about them privately. They were not accessories, they were trophies, and Elizabeth knew it. She weaponized elegance. Her gloves became soft armor worn to protect, to perform, and to command. She often fidgeted with them during meetings, drawing attention to her hands. At banquets, she would remove a glove with ceremony before dining, a subtle display of status. Her gestures with gloves were part of her theatrical mastery, choreographed down to the flick of a wrist. Even her courtiers played along. Noblewomen copied her styles, commissioning similarly scented gloves, though none could match the originals. It became fashionable to scent gloves not for comfort, but for competition who could smell most like the Queen. In this, Elizabeth did what she always did best. She turned her preferences into policy, her scent into standard. Interestingly, her gloves also served a practical purpose. They shielded her hands, which were aging and marked. Like her face and hair, her hands were another battleground for illusion. Perfumed and gloved, they projected perfection. Unseen, they told a different story. Elizabeth's love of gloves extended beyond fashion. She had entire chests filled with them, hundreds of pairs, each tailored for specific occasions, colors, and scents. There were gloves for dancing, gloves for horseback, gloves for gifting, and gloves for mourning. Each pair was a performance. When she died in 1603, many of her personal gloves were kept by her ladies-in-waiting, cherished like sacred objects. Some still exist today, preserved in museums, their scent long gone, but their symbolism intact. They are reminders that power does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers through soft leather and rose oil. In Elizabeth's court, even something as simple as a glove could become diplomacy, a message of inclusion, a velvet command, and in her scented fingers, the monarchy never smelled so sweet or so strategic. In the final decade of Queen Elizabeth I's reign, the mask she had worn for so long began to crack, not metaphorically, but literally. Her once flawless painted face, her meticulously perfumed body, her towering wigs and velvet gloves all began to falter under the weight of time. But if age came for the woman, it never touched the myth, because Elizabeth refused to let it. By the late 1590s, the Virgin Queen was in her 60s, Her health was failing. Her teeth had mostly fallen out, her skin corroded by decades of white. Lead and mercury-based makeup had become mottled, thin and raw. Her hair, what little remained, was sparse and grey. But these changes were never seen, because Elizabeth went to extraordinary lengths to keep them hidden. She stopped appearing in public as often. Her court became a realm of shadows and screens. She gave orders from behind veils. She dismissed attendants who broke her strict visual protocol. Mirrors were banned from her chambers. Artists were forbidden to paint her unless they followed rigid guidelines. No signs of age, no wrinkles, no shadows under the eyes. Her portraits had to be perfect, idealized, borrowed from her youth. If they weren't, she destroyed them. There are whispers from her ladies-in-waiting, chronicled in letters and journals, that she became obsessed with concealment. One servant claimed that a mirror was once accidentally left in her chamber, and upon seeing her reflection, Elizabeth erupted in fury, smashing it against the wall. Another spoke of a maid who was tasked with gently reapplying powder to her shoulders when no one else was looking, ensuring no patch of aging skin would show, even for a second. The mask, by then, was not makeup. It was identity. She had lived for so long as Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the eternal monarch, that to admit Gengevan to herself was to risk collapse. Her rule had been one of performance. She had survived religious uprisings, assassination plots, and the greatest naval threat England had ever faced. She had ruled alone, without a husband or heir, all through an image of divine permanence. To show weakness now would be to unravel that legacy. But the mask came at a cost. By this time, her health was deteriorating rapidly. She suffered from chronic insomnia, anxiety, and what her physicians called melancholia. She lost weight. Her voice, once commanding, became hoarse. Her hands trembled. Some accounts suggest she had open sores on her legs that would not heal. But none of this was allowed to interfere with the image. She refused most medical treatments. She refused rest. She refused pity. She continued to dress in the gowns of her youth, heavy, bejeweled, stiff with symbolism. Her wigs were styled higher than ever, perhaps to distract from the hollowing of her cheeks. Her makeup grew thicker, caked in layers meant to bury the truth of her body. Her perfumes became more pungent. Her presence was still intoxicating. But now, it was the intoxication of denial. Those who knew her best began to worry. Some courtiers begged her to step back from public life. Others suggested she name a successor to begin preparing the realm for transition. She refused. Elizabeth believed, as she had always believed, that to show fear or fatigue was to invite destruction. Her own mother, Anne Boleyn, had lost her head because she was seen as weak. Elizabeth had built her reign on the opposite. In her final months, she descended into near silence. She would sit for hours on a cushion on the floor, refusing to speak, refusing to lie down. She reportedly did not change clothes for days. Her court watched, helpless, as the woman who had once dazzled Europe now seemed suspended between worlds, half woman, half legend. And still, she demanded that her image remain intact. No one was to approach her without permission. Only her most trusted attendants were allowed near. Her physicians could examine her only under veils. She kept the mask on until the very end. When she died in March of 1603, she was surrounded by silence. The image she had curated for 44 years was so strong, so complete, that many in her court were in disbelief. The eternal queen could not die, and yet the body in the bed told. Another story, frail, decaying, human. But even in death, Elizabeth managed to preserve the illusion. Her funeral effigy was modelled not on her final appearance, but on her idealized portraits. Her corpse was dressed in gleaming robes, adorned with jewels, gloved and powdered and perfumed. She was not buried as a woman. She was buried as a myth. It's easy to look back and call it vanity, but that misses the point. Elizabeth's refusal to age publicly wasn't about fear. It was about power. In a world where women were discarded once they wrinkled, where queens were only safe as long as they were desired or feared, she forged a different path. She outlived expectations. She ruled without a man, and she did it all by mastering the one thing no monarch had fully weaponized before appearing. Her mask, in the end, was her masterpiece. And while her body gave out, the mask endured, in paintings, in memory, in history. She died as she had lived, immaculée, unreachable, eternal Queen Elizabeth I left behind more than a kingdom. She left behind a legend crafted in powder and pearl, scented gloves and silence, a carefully curated illusion that endured even after her final breath. Her reign wasn't just marked by military victories or political cunning, but by her unmatched command over image. And at the heart of that image lay a body she fiercely protected, not with shields or swords, but with rituals, refusals, and disguises. It's easy to dismiss her hygiene habits today as unhygienic, even grotesque. The sugar-coated teeth, the rare baths, the perfumed wigs, the lead-based makeup each is startling by modern standards. But to see them only as relics of a filthy past is to miss the deeper truth. These habits weren't carelessness, they were strategy. In a time when women were defined by youth and purity, Elizabeth made herself immortal by refusing to be seen as human. She turned decay into fashion. Her blackened teeth became the envy of noble women who darkened their own smiles to match. Her towering wigs became symbols of power, not concealment. Her gloves became diplomacy, her perfume a form of communication. Every detail was deliberate, every omission a performance. What we remember today as her disgusting hygiene was not negligence, it was narrative control. Elizabeth I crafted a mythology where even filth became sanctified, where the illusion of divine sovereignty eclipsed the need for earthly cleanliness. She ruled a nation through force of will and force of perception. And the irony, it worked. Even now, centuries later, the Virgin Queen lives on in portraits that never aged, stories that never wrinkled, paintings where her skin glows with an ethereal light untouched by time. She remains, to millions, flawless. She endures in history books not as a fragile woman, but as a sovereign carved from marble and myth. That endurance was no accident. It was her masterpiece. Yes, her hygiene habits shock us, but they also revealed the depth of her genius. She understood something that modern celebrities, influencers, and politicians still chase today: the power of the curated self. Elizabeth was the original brand. She knew the court of public opinion could be just as dangerous as any battlefield, and she defended her throne with powder, paint, and perfume. Behind the grime was a vision, behind the rituals was resolve, and behind the mask was a monarch who refused to be reduced to flesh. She knew that to be remembered, she could never be fully known. So, what can we learn from the hygiene of Queen Elizabeth I? That appearances matter, that image, when wielded wisely, becomes influence, that even the most powerful figures in history had to fight not just their enemies, but their mortality, and perhaps most of all that sometimes, to to stay clean in histories. Eyes, you must stay dirty in life. Elizabeth didn't just bathe in rose water, she bathed in myth. And in doing so, she left a legacy that, centuries later, was still trying to uncover, to understand, to wash clean. But the truth is, some legends are meant to be a little dirty. That's how they last.